dates the 7th plague to the middle of January, when the crops begin to mature. Now we get to the 8th plague, locusts. This is chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. Clouds of locusts, a familiar pestilence for farmers in the ancient Near East, devour whatever crops or plants were left after the hailstorm. The locusts come from the east wind by God's command. The court of Pharaoh is, very impressed by the power of Moses and his God. The ruler now offers to let only the men go free, because adult males take part in the religious rituals. Not enough, says Moses. The locust plague rests upon natural phenomena. The east wind brings the locust. The wind shifts, and the west wind drives the locust into the Red Sea. So this happens quite often in the Near East. It's not that strange an occurrence. However, the intensity of the plague points to a divine hand. Now, let's get to the 9th plague, which is chapter 10, verses 21 through 23. Essentially, a thick darkness that can be felt is brought on by the wind of the desert. The wind carries sand and dust. But the Hebrews are once again untouched by the plague. They have light. This hot desert wind is known as the Kam Sin. It blows in from the desert during the spring months of, from March to May. There's so much dust and sand in the Kam Sin that the air is darkened. It becomes very difficult to see, and it's often difficult to breathe. The 9th plague is symbolic because the Lord God is now confronting the Egyptian sun god Amun-Ra, the divine father and god of the sun to the Egyptians. And the Lord Yahweh is blocking out the sun by the wind, the sand, and the dust. Now, we have the announcement of the final plague, the death of the firstborn. This plague is evidence that the favor, it proves the favor of Moses and the Hebrews in the eyes of God. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, is essentially the spoliation of the Egyptian people, because the firstborn, from the royalty to the peasants to the slaves, will now die. This final plague is linked with the first Passover ceremony, which is then linked to the festival of unleavened bread. Now, the first Passover means in Hebrew it means pesah, to protect, have compassion, or pass over. Now, this unleavened bread festival that's linked with the first Passover ceremony is a very ancient nomadic spring festival. It's now reinterpreted as a memorial of God's deliverance, his people from bondage. The Hebrews at the time of the 10th plague now become an organized congregation and will celebrate their nocturnal festival that's celebrated during the full moon as a remembrance of God's deeds to end their bondage. Lamb's blood is used. It's regarded as God's portion of the sacrifice, and it's smeared on the doorpost and lintels. This is the holy place of the house or home. The lamb's blood is smeared as protection against the destroyer, the angel of death that will come to destroy Egypt's firstborn. This angel of death is a manifestation of the Lord's power. Now, hyssop is used. It's dipped in the lamb's blood. This foliage, this aromatic plant, was thought to have magical powers. and was often used by the Hebrews for ritual purposes. So they dipped the hyssop in the lamb's blood, and they spread it around the door and the lintel as protection. Now, the leavened bread festival, it was, as I mentioned, a nocturnal festival that happens during the full moon. It was a 7-day festival. Was during the time of the barley harvest. And this festival, this nocturnal unleavened bread festival, now becomes closely connected with this first Passover celebration. The absence of yeast, unleavened bread, is symbolic of the hasty preparation. Yeast is not used, it's excluded, because it has fermenting and corrupting power. It's a ritually unclean substance, and yeast could contaminate the entire harvest. All right, so that's the origin of the unleavened bread festival, which, remember, is now linked to the first Passover celebration. Now, with the death of the Egyptian firstborn and the first Passover celebration, essentially 430 years of Hebrew-Egyptian Hebrew-Egyptian phase is now over. The descent into Egypt, the time of Joseph, which happens during the High Coast invasions, is around 1720 BC. And the Hebrew departure, which happens the time of Moses, is around 1290 BC. So, essentially the Pharaoh, the Egyptian people, can take no more. And the Hebrews now depart from Egypt. This is in chapter 12, verses 29 to 51. Now, the starting places for the Israelite exodus happened in the cities of Ramses and Succoth, cities that the Hebrews helped to build. According to the text, there's 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, roughly 2.5 million people. This is a mixed crowd of Hebrew tribes. Now, historians and scholars consider the number in the book of Exodus an exaggeration. They do not believe that the land of Goshen, the Hebrew settlement area, could have supported such a large population, but there's no doubt, there's no question that many thousands of people are now fleeing Egypt. The numbers may be exaggerated, we don't know, but there's many thousands of Hebrews now fleeing from Egypt. The Hebrew deliverance. All right, now this happens in chapter 13, verses 17 until chapter 14, verse 31.